Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dutch Institute. I'm Michael Kwakkelstein, the director, and it is my pleasure to introduce Bette Talvacchia to you. It's wonderful. We're very pleased and honored to be able to start off the new year with a lecture. So let me introduce you properly. Bette Talvacchia is a distinguished professor emerita of art history at the University of Connecticut. She holds a PhD in art history from Stanford University. Her work as a scholar focuses on the art and culture of the Italian Renaissance and on issues of sexuality and gender. Her present research has expanded to include investigation of the continuity between historical art and the modern contemporary tradition. Dr. Talvacchia's books include Taking Positions on the Erotic in Renaissance Culture, that was published in 1999 by Princeton University Press. A book on Raphael, Phaidon Press, that is 2007. A Cultural History of Sexuality in the Renaissance, Berg Publishers, Oxford, 2011. And the two Michelangelos, that was published by Lund Humphreys in 2021, which was honored as a Choice Outstanding academic title in 2023. Dr. Talvacchia has been a fellow, a guest scholar, a Robert Lehman visiting professor at Villa Itati, that's the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies here in Florence. She has held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery, Washington, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. During 2011 and 12, after the renovation was finished, you were the first NIKI scholar in residence here. That was with the Antonella Damascena conference, and you edited proceedings. Dr. Talvacchia has given talks in many locations throughout the United States, Italy, and England, as well as the Museum for Western Art in Tokyo. An enthusiastic and eloquent public speaker, she engages with diverse audiences on a wide range of topics, an initiative that has become an important part of Dr. Talvacchia's professional profile. The National Endowment for the Humanities awarded her a fellowship as part of its inaugural Public Scholars Program in 2015-16. More recently, she has presented a course at the New York Public Library entitled The Other Renaissance, Gender and Sexuality in Renaissance Art. A year ago, January, right? Exactly a year ago, I don't know, to the day, she was also our guest, and she delivered a series of 4 highly inspiring lectures entitled Common Ground, Explorations of Contemporary Art Through a Renaissance Lens. Those lectures, if you missed them, you can still see them on our YouTube channel. So it is wonderful to have Dr. Talvacchia back with us, and this time she will talk about Fra Angelico, and that's the painter whose work is at the center of 2 major and hugely successful exhibitions here in Florence. Betty, floor is yours.
And I would like to start by thanking the director, Dr. Michael Kwakkelstein, for having me back. You know, I didn't do enough damage the first time, so here I am again with great pleasure, and especially to be able to participate in all of the excitement in Florence right now around the figure of Fra Angelico. Who knew he would become a rock star in Florence in the 21st century? So as we think about him, what I wanted to do was to maybe give you a few more and different things to think about than you've already been inundated with so many new ideas, I'm sure, in reading about him and looking at these wonderful exhibitions. So here are a few more ideas. So I'm just going to do very particular things, not to take an overview, but try to zero in on a few ideas and then end up where I left off last year by discussing with you a few modern artists who have taken Fra Angelico as an inspiration and see what they have done to have a dialogue with him. So that's the way we'll end up. But first, let me start by giving you the litany that perhaps you've already read or heard of all of the names we know this artist by. And I'm going to click as Lex told me, and then do this. Yes. So this is why I'm going to talk about labels. How do we name this artist? How do we label him? And then aspects of decorum and decoration in his art. So as I say, this is a little very specialized range of things which I hope will come together and give you some even more ways of thinking about Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, of course, his name as a monk, Beato Angelico, and that's not the only way we know him, of course. We know him as Guido di Pietro, sometimes called Guido di Piero, so through his family names. Guidolino, Vasari mentions that this is clearly a family name, a nickname, kind of term of endearment, known as Guidolino. Then, Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, he chose that as his name when he became a monk. And then from that, Fra Angelico, even to, and especially here in Italy, he would be called Beato Angelico. And as you are thinking about this, the exhibition has put Angelico as the name, and it's almost as though that's now become an affectionate name that we call him. So here's the array of names. Now, I'm jumping into that tradition that I just mentioned that so many others have of listing all of these names. But often they're listed because it's intriguing that we can at least name this artist in so many different ways. But what I want to do is follow that up and say, well, why have all these names changed? And does it make a difference how we call him? Does it make an impact on how we think of his art by calling him, for example, Beato Angelico? So I'm going to have this conversation with you, but first I just want to quickly read a few lines so I get my... Sorry?
No, I apologize.
Oh, okay. I thought I already had an objection to something I said, so I'll get started and then you can object. But anyway, so to state the premise clearly, the name with which we label the artist has an impact on how we look at and how we interpret his work. Given that his career, despite beginning outside of the religious context, was overwhelmingly spent as a monk, that ensures that we almost always use his religious name, his monastic title. But the literature goes far beyond that, having bestowed on him a name that calls him an angel, calls him angelic, then indeed eventually a friar on the way to canonization, because of course that Beato is the first step in church practice protocol for someone who has been put forward as being, having lived such a saintly life that that person can officially become a saint. Okay. So his identity as a professional artist who lived under the rules of the Dominican order, and in fact the severe rules of the observant Dominicans, that has really been subsumed by this almost saint whose art was made exclusively as a manifestation of his religious calling. And I think that's where we often end up when we use the term Beato Angelico. So I'm going to go through what I think happens with these names. So we'll start with Guido di Pietro. His mortal remains, as they usually say, are what you see on the screen right now. He's buried in the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. And that, as I say, whatever is under there, the remains of Guido. But of course, Guido, who became Fra Giovanni, he chose that title, and he's buried with the monastic habit as really the thing that you notice the most. And if you look even more closely at that, there is a kind of portrait, but it's really a symbolic portrait. It shows him as a monk. The facial features are rather generic. And so unfortunately, even though this was carved very soon after his death, we don't have something that helps us out to see. Perhaps we always like to see what artists look like, of course, because we have that in common. We want to see them as fellow human beings. So it's right that the emphasis is given to his existence as a monk, because after all, he chose that vocation as an adult. He was already a professional painter, and from what we can tell, one who was on his way to success. But at a certain moment, he decided to become an observant Dominican. So we would say this is not something that was forced on him. He clearly saw it as something that would work in harmony with Guido's professional aspirations as a painter. So how else can we get close to him and think about these names and labels? Well, here is a little panel from the Armadio degli Argenti, which I hope you saw in the exhibition. And in the back of that scene where Christ is talking with the priests and explicating scripture for them, you see that in the background, I've given it to you in a detail, you see the monk standing, listening, being present, taking part, at least in his mind, in the dispute that's going on. And I think that a scholar has hypothesized that this is a kind of projection of the artist, and I think it is I'd go along with that idea. It's like a symbolic self-portrait. Once again, we don't see specific facial features. It's that identity as a monk that's most important. And I like the fact that it's put in that particular scene, because remember, if you're a Dominican, the order of preachers, you're going to study your theology very carefully so that you can expound on theological points with authority. And that's what Christ is doing as a child in this scene. And do notice on the left, Mary is making this wonderful, we're talking about le point digital. She's counting on her fingers. She's also expounding points. This is highly unusual, and I think it must indicate that the artist had a particular veneration for Mary, and in fact, this Mary is a very venerated figure in the Dominican order. So that gets us maybe a little closer to Fra Giovanni. We have a document from 1423 calling him Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, and that's important because Fiesole was at that moment the seat of the observant Dominicans. And before that, we find him in 1417 becoming a member of a confraternity at the Carmine as Guido di Pietro. In 1418, he signs a work, Guido di Pietro, so still using his family name. And then 1423, he's Fra Giovanni. So those are our parameters for when he entered into his religious vocation and took on his new identity as a monk. Okay. The other nickname, or name that is endearing, the Guidolino, the little Guido, I wanted to have in my head to mention that for a religious figure, we have a bit of information about his family life. That is, his brother was also an artist, a manuscript illuminator who also was a Dominican monk. His sister's son was an artist, so his nephew was also an artist and worked with him in his commission for Orvieto. So you're seeing some details from frescoes in Orvieto, the cathedral in Orvieto. And that nephew, we think it was he, we have documentation that he fell off the scaffolding and died while working. And after that point, Fra Giovanni did not return to Orvieto to finish the commission. He was going to do it for several summers in a row because he was working in Rome, and who knows what all the reasons were. But there again, we get a touching little view into his family life, because when he worked at Orvieto, we have a number of documents that give us these bits of information. So I show you, as the wording is telling you, a self-portrait by Luca Signorelli, who about 50 years later picked up the commission and painted what we now see in the chapels in that church. And beside him, there is a portrait of Fra Angelico. So this, I think, gets us pretty close to the monk and the man in terms of his features. One scholar has this very important idea, which I think should be followed up with more thought, that we know that Fra Giovanni prepared drawings as he was getting that commission going in Orvieto. And perhaps he included a self-portrait because he was painting the Last Judgment scenes, and there was a Tuscan tradition of artist self-portraits in Last Judgment scenes. So I think that's something, a plausible explanation, that we might be seeing Signorelli's version of a self-portrait that Fra Giovanni left before he stopped working there. Again, just a thought about this. But whatever else, Luca Signorelli paid his respects to his predecessor, who did not then complete the work in that chapel. And I always have thought, although I've never, followed this up, but think of Raphael's portrait with that unknown person in the stanze. It may be he got the idea from here. I'm going to follow that up in a few minutes. Okay. Here again, we're not positive, this may be a portrait by Benozzo Gozzoli of Fra Angelico. And this comes from Gozzoli working in that Orvieto commission, because he was the, I would say, most accomplished student of Fra Angelico. And Gozzoli made this drawing. We think it might have been a portrait of his master. And they were doing a lot of portraits for rondels in that series of frescoes. So as we see this perhaps potential portrait by Gozzoli, I like to think it is, we can think of Fra Giovanni. That's of course how he was known in his working life. Fra Giovanni had students, Gozzoli being perhaps the most talented. He had a group of students. He set up workshops. He could work independently because he didn't have to belong to the guild, since he was in a religious order. And he got paid, of course, for his work in conversation with his prior, and the money would go to the monastery. This is clear from documents. And also we know a little bit about those assistants because this was not usual, that they were listed separately because, of course, the money had to be separated, since Fra Giovanni's fee was going to the monastery. So Orvieto gives us a lot of information about it. Let's move on with trying to get some sense of the man and then his movement to the level of Beato Angelico. Here's what Giorgio Vasari uses in his biography of Fra Angelico, the 1568 edition, as you see, once more making the point that he was a monk as well as being a very accomplished artist. And he is, his name in that portrait is Fra Giovanni da Fiesole. And I'm going to go back and forth just a little bit here. That's how we see, because Vasari is very important, as we know, in the history of almost any Renaissance artist, but Fra Giovanni in particular. Vasari, in his life of Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, mentions that he was so saintly that he would cry, he would burst into tears as he painted scenes of the crucifixion. That's how devout he was. All right, so we're moving a little bit into legend with that kind of story. And, when I think of this fresco of Saint Dominic in the cloister area of San Marco, which Vasari could have easily seen, not so clear he could have gotten upstairs to the cells even in the 16th century, but he certainly saw this. And there is Fra Angelico's version of Saint Dominic in totally emotive state, emotionally reacting to this truth of the crucifixion of Christ. And I thought, that would be a wonderful point of departure for Vasari then saying that Fra Giovanni cried when he made paintings of the crucifixion. So I think we can start to follow a little bit the anecdotes that get built up around the historical figure. Now, it really was Vasari who made very popular this naming Fra Angelico, because he used that concept, even though he named him properly in the Vita. He said that it was because he was very like all of the saints and the angels that he painted. All right, so that's him speaking as an art historian who once, remember, one of his absolute reasons for writing those vitae is he wanted to aggrandize the profession of the artist. So you get an artist who was also a religious figure, who was a very, a devout enough religious figure that you could hang this legend on him without fear of contradiction. And Vasari pushed that, because then you have a model for a saintly artist. So that was very much to his purpose. So he used the name Fra Angelico, but he didn't invent it. As many of you know, that came from a contemporary of Fra Giovanni. So a contemporary who had a bit of a longer life, another Dominican named Giovanni da Carella, who wrote a poem called the Theotokon. And in that poem, he said he was, speaking of Fra Giovanni, he was a pictor angelicus. That's where we get the name. Now, it's interesting because in Dominican writing and protocol, say, they were beholden to the writings of Thomas Aquinas. And he was always called the Doctor Angelicus, right? So we're getting a parallel between this angelic painter in the mold, let's say, of the angelic teacher. So there we get again how the Dominicans built a legend around this figure. Now, I think it's interesting, because it's not always mentioned, that Corella also compared Fra Giovanni to Giotto. So he was making a comparison as a painter as well as a saintly monk. And this kind of legendary monk seems to follow all of the requisites that Dominicans held important for a saintly life. Okay, so you see that construction. We can think of all of these good things and say that this Dominican monk who was a painter had all of them. And therefore he becomes Fra Angelico, displacing not only Guido di Pietro, but also Fra Giovanni. So let's see what Raphael does. I'm going to say here we're going to start to see the Beato Angelico. In the Disputa in the Vatican stanza, I show you a detail with what we think is a portrait of Fra Giovanni, who becomes through Vasari later Fra Angelico, but Raphael is showing him not in the Parnassus scene with the poets and the artists. He's showing them with the theologians in the Disputa scene, right? So Raphael is already picking up that idea that he had something to do with saintliness and theology, more privileging that more than the arts in the way he showed him here. And if you think of Raphael's father, Giovanni Santi, who, remember, also wrote a poem about artists who were doing great things in Italy, he mentioned Fra Giovanni and said he was, I think, always yearning for he was painting with fervent zeal, that kind of thing. So you already get a tradition from father to son to see the artist in a certain way. And while we're looking at that, I want to make my case for Vasari all the way in 1568, looking to Raphael right from the early decade of the 16th century. I flipped the slide around so that you can see, I think there's a very close relationship between those two portraits. And I'm not sure where Raphael got his information from, but it is, again, it's very venerable in the way he's shown as a theologian. Okay, so I would say here we're already at the level of Beato, which did not become official until 1982. So in many of our lifetime, that was when Pope John Paul II actually beatified Fra Angelico. But for all those centuries, he was already referred to in that way. And 2 years later, I believe, he made him officially the patron of painters. So here, something being confirmed by the church that had already been in operation for centuries. And as we explore that, here is what Carlo Dolci did in his idealized or ideal portrait of Beato Angelico. See the date. We know from Baldinucci that Dolci asked for someone to make a copy of that portrait in Rome, send it up here to Florence, and he used it as a basis. So Dolci's trying to give him a bit of sort of more particular features, that long nose, the hint of a cleft chin, somehow that's always there. But notice here what happens. He gets that celestial light over his head. So here again, we're pushing the Beato idea. And I think that that is related to how Fra Giovanni painted St. Dominic. As you went around the cells in San Marco, you might have noticed that you always or often saw one protagonist in the scene with a little red star above his head. And that was always telling you it was St. Dominic. That's how he identified him. And I show you just one example of many, many, many. So we see a later artist taking that idea and using it for Fra Angelico. When we get into the 19th century, here's some of these wonderful historical paintings, history paintings that 19th century artists, especially French, love to do. So Flandrin does his version of Fra Angelico visited by angels, and you can see that he takes some ideas from Vasari. There he is breaking down in tears in his emotional response to the suffering of Christ, and he does it just, you can vaguely see, based on a painting that is in one of the cells in San Marco, and angels are there, kind of cheering him on, helping him out. So he gets associated with angels, this angelic painter. Here's another example that I thought was particularly wonderful, that Maignan shows you the dream of Fra Angelico, and there he is with his vision of what to paint, with an angels actually executing it for him. So we're pushing that hagiography even further, where all he has to do is dream, and then angels come and execute his work for him. So we've gotten a little bit of an idea moving from Guidolino to Fra Giovanni, Fra Angelico, Beato Angelico, and they're all labeling him. So I thought this might be a moment just to take a momentary pause and think of what labels do. Well, I think it was the 1970s, one liqueur manufacturer got the great idea, anyway, of making Fra Angelico liqueur, and they made the bottle in the more or less kind of shape of a monk. And you see, I don't need to be too more explicit on that. So here we get a legend that gets into very popular culture, but that made me think of this again. We're thinking about how these names label the artist. And if you are an Italian speaker or a French speaker, you have a clearer path to that because etiquetta is a label. And in French, etiquette is a label. In English, we say label, which has nothing to do with etiquetta, but French and Italian save that connection that comes, in fact, from the French court. That in the French court, you would get a little card each day telling you how to behave, what the protocol for the day was. That little label, that little card became an etiquette. And that meant proper behavior. And therefore, in English, we say etiquette, right? Just as we always compact these words. So if we have that label, it gives us a sense of what's correct, what's proper. And how do we apply that then to the way we label Fra Angelico? Well, from that idea, I wanted to go to these thoughts of, did we need to have a very religious person to paint religious, successful, moving, convincing religious paintings? Of course, the answer is no. I mean, if you look at these two examples by his contemporaries, Gentili da Fabriano makes a Virgin and Child, close enough in style, and you also feel convinced about its religiosity, about its sincerity. I don't know anything about what kind of a man Gentili da Fabriano was, aside from his being quite a wonderful painter. We know a little bit about Filippo Lippi, and he, of course, is always the foil for Fra Angelico, the saint on one side and the kind of defrocked monk on the other. But he did us the great favor by not following the rules, by getting together with Monaca, and that gave us Filippino Lippi. So everything worked out wonderfully in the end. But teasing aside, looking at that Annunciation, would you say, oh, that was a monk that didn't follow his vows? No. So why do we do the reverse? To say the artistic personality and the man, artist, woman's personality have to mesh. They don't. So again, for some great backup to thinking about that, I can paraphrase Meyer Shapiro, who paraphrased Hegel. So this is a great, no one can give me an argument about this, right? Saying that in an age of spirituality, you don't need to be religious to make religious art. Okay, so just things to keep in mind to help us from over-interpreting what we see with Fra Angelico. In fact, let's look at some of his early works. Now, as much as we can tell, these two paintings would be from the time he was still, what shall I say, a regular person before he began to follow his religious vocation, which, by the way, I'm not diminishing. I think he was absolutely to it, or he would have never been an observant Dominican. But here he is in his, as a layman, let's say. He joined that confraternity as a layman, so he had religious impulse. But here we have him showing, and I thought it would be good, since I'm speaking about this, the Madonna of Humility. Now, this style is not very different from what we see in his later work. Sure, he, got more skill, he developed his ideas more, but I find his work very coherent and consistent, starting from the few early works that we can identify, where you see there is a delight in the use of gold leaf. And this goes against what we study in Renaissance art classes. The progressive artists are not supposed to like gold leaf. They're supposed to be forced to have done it by the patrons. Keep your eye on that, because you're going to see him developing wonderful ways of working with gold leaf. We already see it here. This Madonna, okay, she's seated not on a big throne, presumably on the ground, but look at the brocaded rug that is painted with great detail and delight. Look at the details of her costume. Already the colorful wings of the angels, the worked gold background there on the right. So I want us to not get rid of Guido di Pietro as we watch what happened to this artist. The one thing that I see in these early works that might be a difference from his later ones, if you notice those two figures of the Christ child, they are just about nude, if not completely nude, and they're a bit athletic. This is like the way Masaccio was painting. And so they were, of course, complete contemporaries. They're often discussed in the 15th century as both being very progressive artists, even though we tend to push them apart. But that is a figure type. That's about as close as Fra Giovanni ever got to Masaccio's very classicizing figure type. So that's a change that you might notice. But for the rest of it, very consistent. And since I brought up Masaccio, let's have a look at a Fra Angelico in comparison to the wonderful collaborative work by Masaccio and Masolino that's in the Uffizi. So again, you see, well, they're set up in the same way. You see the difference mostly in the figure types, right? And that is one of the things that it's, in a way, it's almost thrilling to look at in the Masaccio and Masolino, that you see Masaccio's really athletic, classical figure for the Christ child, and Masolino's much more delicate figural style for St. Anne with them. Okay, so spatially, they're doing more or less the same thing, but what I want to direct your attention to there, the detail with which Fra Angelico paints that carpet, as opposed to a very generic brocade that even Masolino, in conjunction with Masaccio, gives you there. And those beautiful white feathery angel wings, but Fra Angelico would never leave wings that unembellished. So we're seeing differences in style. And this, as I say, I think is one of the hallmarks. And how can that be for a monk who has gotten rid of all of his earthly possessions? But Guido still loved these fabrics, I am convinced, because he would never be able to paint them that way. So we're going to see how he reconciled these two elements of his personality. But they're apparent from the start. When we talk about him, most of the time, that is to say, Fra Angelico, we think of him with the austere style that he absolutely did use in the frescoes of San Marco. But remember, first of all, fresco rather than panel paintings with oil that we saw just a moment ago. And also, this is an extremely particular commission, right? That it's for his community now of monks. They're following the precepts that Dominicans had for what kind of images were important to have to surround the monks in their daily prayers and meditations. And remember that in many of these cells, the monks who were the theologians and the preachers, they were living there. So what they needed was something to spark their deeper meditation. They didn't need full narratives with all the details. Certainly, they didn't need lots of brocades and so forth, because that would go against their particular way of life. So the austerity of the San Marco frescoes has something to do with the medium, but also with the particular commission. And it is an anomaly, I would say, in Fra Angelico's work, because if you think of the frescoes, if you know the ones he did in Rome in the Vatican, that's a whole different style, which really links up with papal protocol and interest. So as all good Quattrocento artists, he would paint decorously, that is, with the proper decorum for the patron and for the situation that he was painting for. Okay, so I'm going to, give you a couple more of these austere examples, but even there, it's a little bit qualified when you come to think of it. Look at the angel of the Annunciation. He put in those splendid wings, obviously not strictly necessary. You see that he's very linked to Masaccio in terms of his spatial construction. This is what was new in that period of the Renaissance, and you can see he was a master of it. Also a particular kind of even lighting, which I'll talk more about later. I like that detail with St. Peter Martyr because of the scale change of the angel wing and the monk back there in the background. And I wanted to also point out, this is something I've noticed recently. All of you might have seen it ages ago. But you know how Peter Martyr almost always has that hatchet in his head? That's his symbol of how he was martyred. And that hatchet, even when he's totally serene, even when he's, in heaven, and Fra Angelico never put that hatchet in there. I think it was a bit against his aesthetic. We get the man coming back in there. We see the blood, we see the wound, but not that hatchet. I don't think I've ever seen it. Might be one time, but anyway, that little detail, which to me is something that shows you a bit of the individual. Also notice when you look at the figure of Mary that I've singled out in the middle, where's her body? Where are her knees? Right? It's her drapery that forms that body. So the other thing that we see pretty consistently in Fra Angelico, I'll go with that name now, he's not ever interested in that classical volumetric body type that Masaccio was so good at. He, I think, wanted to have that disjunction between the very readable earthly space that he could construct with perspective, and then more ethereal figures that are telling you you're dealing not with human beings, but with members of the celestial sphere. And their halos, of course, do that as well. So once again, even in this austere style, you have sometimes not gold leaf, but that kind of liquid gold that was used. He just does not completely stay away from it. And of course, another of the amazing frescoes that is in the hallway rather than in a specific cell, this Madonna of the Shadows. And we call her that because if you notice, those classical pilasters cast shadows at the top. The figures do not. And that, I was looking really hard the other day to just be sure I could say that. I don't think any of the figures cast shadows, but the architecture does. So concrete or marble, as we have it, readable space, even that niche half dome behind Mary, gold leaf. But watch how he creates space, even when he uses gold leaf. Because that's another truism that we often say, gold, you put it on the surface, it's flat. Well, look at what he could do with it. So that's a medium that I think was particularly congenial to him. And of course, you notice the beautiful halos. So that is celestial. I want to say something more about halos. It's wonderful to follow halos when you're looking at Fra Angelico's work. In that detail from the Lamentation, there are two figures in conversation, but it's very nice their halos don't get in the way of each other. And in fact, one figure, his hair comes out in front of the other's halo. So everything is just as it should be. The Nicodemus figure, or Joseph of Arimathea, who's lowering the body of Christ, that halo is almost gone, clearly added a secco, but that was put like, the Frisbee halo in perspective, while others were quite flat, others moving a bit. So what I think, I'm going to let you look at more halos, the detail taken from the big crucifixion in the chapter house. Look for a moment at that detail. Have you noticed before that Mary Magdalene's halo is smack in front of her face? Maybe not, because he's such a convincing designer that you don't see that as something that bothers you. And I would say it's because the design is what's important. There, he's not trying to convince you about a specific space, because these are all celestial figures and halos are celestial anyway. They don't have to follow our rules, but they do want to follow good design. And that was his solution for letting that figure have her halo, but without blocking your view of her or anyone else. So as I say, this is an interesting thing that tells you something about his approach following the halos. Let's now have a look, we must, at the Great Annunciation that greets you at the top of the steps in the monastery of San Marco. And once more, look at the very convincing space that he creates, very like the architecture in which you're standing. The angel, though, gets a great compliment of beautiful garment. If you look at the details, there's much more embellishment than is strictly necessary, even to show that that's a celestial figure. The halo is worked and incised. Mary gets her halo. She is dressed very simply. That undergarment, or the, I can't call it a dress, the garment under the mantle that she's wearing, it's practically not painted at all, which we don't know if there was something there that came off. I don't think so. But he's painting very thinly often in the fresco medium. But when you look at that angel, take a moment to look at those wings. I'm going to make a real point about this. So this is the first pass. If you moved your head back and forth, even on the recent cloudy days, you would see that that wing sparkles. And the reason that it sparkles is because he mixed silicate in with the pigment. And that is celestial sparkle. So again, even when he's at his most austere, his aesthetic comes through very clearly. And when we deal then with panel paintings for important and either secular patrons or important church groups, church buildings, then he can follow his own rules about how much decoration. So here's where we get to the decoration is decorous, because Thomas Aquinas would say yes, because he said that visceral pleasure is a way of getting to transcendent pleasure. Remember, it works beautifully with Renaissance ideas that beauty equals good, and that was being developed in the 15th century. And Thomism did put a premium on enjoyment of beauty as a way of moving to contemplation of paradise, of all of the good and the beauty that's going to greet you in paradise. So this is how I think Guido was in harmony with Fra Giovanni, because he was in an order that accepted these earthly channels to celestial, to the celestial realm. And Thomas would have said, I'm simplifying, but the bottom line is that we're not talking about what is it like vistoso, that's something that's too lavish. We're talking about celestial splendor. And that's why it is decorous to put all of this embellishment in the paintings. You can see, again, I don't have to say too much, but once again, if you just try to notice these wings, they're incised, their stamps are used, their washes of color, and you can see there's a gold cloth of honor behind Mary. The angel's garments, once again, very elaborate. And this is telling you about those, the celestial realm of those figures. Even when he did a subject, like the suffering Christ, where he makes the blood and the thorns so dramatic, and again, visceral. He's working toward your emotions. Look at the collar that he puts on him, on the Christ figure. You don't need to put an incised gold rim on a tunic with gems inside, unless you want to say that, okay, he's a suffering human, but he's still Christ, he's still God, and he belongs to the celestial sphere, and he deserves this kind of praise that we can give him through gems and gold and ornament. And do look at the curls in his hair as well. So if we say that his style is ornate, or in English we would say decorative, it's probably better to think of ornate in English and ornato, because that gets closer to the way I think they would have seen it. That would, of course, be taken from rhetorical studies. The ornato is a particular way of speaking. Remember, they're an order of preachers, and you would let's say that I think Quintilian said, anything that goes beyond clear and necessary is ornate. We've got a lot of ornate there. And in the 15th century, early, Cristoforo Landino talked about Fra Giovanni, and he gave that string. I'm going to try. I did this with my colleagues yesterday. The string of adjectives. Landino said, Fra Giovanni Angelico et devoto et vezzoso et ornato molto. And there might have been one more, but I wanted the ornato molto, e grandissima facilità. And it's interesting there too, because are they adjectives for the man, Fra Angelico, Fra Giovanni Angelico, or is it il dipinto e così? I think there's always going to be movement across both of those, but that assessment of Landino so early, I think, is still perfect. And to have something vezzoso, which might be what charming, I like the idea, I think someone said caressable, it's a beautiful word, to have that and devout at the same time, that's quite something. And Angelico did that. So here's another little predella panel where I thought a wonderful detail is one of the hats that the magus who's bending over to worship Christ puts on the ground to show his respect. And look at that series of, can I get that for you? You can see it though. It looks as though you've almost got like a crown of pearls that are on little spile, right, on these pins around there. And then the rim has those pearls. Now, again, that goes beyond the call of duty. That's from delight. That is from the impulse to ornato as something positive. Okay, going to move along. So let's look at all the gold. I won't take quite as long on these, but when you look at the panel paintings, think of that, all that gold that's incised, it creates space. There's different spatial planes that each of those bits of gold take up. And again, you see not just now the gold and the angel's wings, but Mary is got her hand on her heart, so it's a devotional gesture, but it does feature that beautiful brooch that she's wearing to clasp her mantle together, in addition to which there's a brooch on her shoulder, the spilla a stella, and many, many of Fra Angelico's virgins are wearing that brooch on her shoulder, which is the Stella Maris, right? The star of the sea. That's another honorific name for Mary because she guides us. So if you note all those details, this love of gems in the coronation scene, Christ, he's not placing the crown on Mary's head. It's already there. He's putting a gem into her crown. So again, a particular, that there is a textual basis for that, but it's a choice that Fra Angelico makes. There, I just get you, a few views to prove my point. All of these Madonnas have their stella a spilla, and there's a detail of how beautifully and with what detail he would paint these. And if we look, for example, at the great Linaioli altarpiece, and remember, this is for the linen drapers. So all of the drapery that surrounds Mary, the drapery across the bench that she sits on, the cushion, this would have a lot of significance for his patrons. And indeed, he paints these with great, great detail. So here on the left, let's have a look. I'm trying to find the arrow. Okay, we've got one drape in gold coming over. The reverse of it looks like that. Here's the pattern, which I show you in detail for the bench. There's a tassel for the cushion that Mary sits on, and on and on. All these layers overlapping that he is painting, to the point where I should mention Karl Strelke's name, since he did such a wonderful job of putting these exhibitions together. He at one point suggested that perhaps Fra Angelico even designed fabrics because he showed so much knowledge in his painting of them. And indeed, in the 1420s, 30s, there were great developments in working silk brocade in Florence. And if you're a scholar of the celebration of the Duomo being ready for use in 1436. They say just centimeters and centimeters, yards and yards and yards of drapery were surrounding everything, the papal throne, the environment. So Angelico is in a culture where this matters, and he is a great master of documenting that. So if I have now made my case for Guido di Pietro always painting along with Fra Giovanni, and for the legends that sometimes prevent us from thinking about that collaboration, let me take you to some of the modern artists who have had this dialogue with Fra Angelico. And I just keep using that name because that's the one we really mostly use. This, as I say, follows up my exploration. And the one thing I'll repeat is that I am for wiping out the word appropriation, as we often use in contemporary discourse about this, because it's not stolen, it's not taken away. These artists are engaging dialogue with their own history as artists. So Robert Polidori, a photographer, who in 2018 made a series of stupendous photographs in San Marco. And I had the great pleasure of having a conversation with Robert Polidori and asked him about this. And he is a great admirer of Fra Angelico's art. He sees him as a philosopher as well as a painter. And one of the things he loved the most was the light. And he tried to not only, actually beyond capturing it, he tried to have an image that showed his memory of the experience of walking through San Marco. So he told me that he scanned the images, he made the colors a bit more intense by 5 to 10%, and he also put up artificial lighting to get the effect he wanted. So I'm just going to show you a few examples because you'll see without my words what he was after. He does great things with showing you art in its context. And you see, again, more complex images of these frescoes than you usually do in his works because he gives you that architectural environment. And he said that he was also very influenced by the work of Frances Yates called The Art of Memory. And she talks about the history of mnemonic systems where you construct buildings in your mind, right? And in each room or in each particular point of the building, you put a word or a thought, and that's how you follow your oratory sequence. And so Robert Polidori read that, was influenced by it, and he thinks of these rooms as vessels of memory, which I thought was a beautiful way of thinking about it. Also, he said he wanted to get Holy Spirit light. And by that, he meant this very even light that the Quattrocento artists created, and that he wanted it as though you were in an outer space with no dust, no hazy particles, a very clear light. So he manipulated the photography to get this, to end up with this. I'll go too quickly because, of course, one could speak for much longer on Polidori's work. But have a look at Mark Rothko. Several critics now have mentioned that he was an admirer of Fra Angelico's work. And often, quite rightly, they will say that it was because he came to Florence and he saw really the spirituality of these works in set environments that were not, in the commercial world and so forth. And that's true, but he saw a lot of frescoes in Italy. And I think that if we go back and look, one of the things that Robert Motherwell tells us about Rothko is that he was secretive about his working method, but he wanted to approximate tempera in modern materials. So think about that for a moment, because I just want to, say that in these works that were originally for the Seagram building in New York, when he found out it was going to be a restaurant, like, no way. So he pulled those out, and he gave a group of 9 to the Tate before his death, and was satisfied that they be shown together in something that approximated the proper lighting conditions, because when you see a Rothko really brightly lit, you're not getting the experience. They're extremely subtle. They need a really low light. And Rothko would say, the lower, the better. And that image of the maroon painting on the left gives you a sense of how they're luminous from within. And he evolved that from his knowledge of Quattrocento paintings and Fra Angelico in particular. He painted very thin. Look at the way Angelico lights up the back of that wall with very transparent washes. How you do that in fresco is another secret. Again, look at how thinly painted Mary's garment is. Rothko loved that. And he, one of his assistants finally gave some information saying that he would work with pigment and rabbit glue and put that down on the surface, and then get other pigments that he'd mix with resin and put that across, and then maybe a thin veneer of oil, the layers upon layers, but always thinly painting. And what he also said, apart from this light to Motherwell, who said he said it when he was drunk, because otherwise he would have never told me, was that it was the light of these artists that he wanted to approximate for his own time. And when he finally got the chance to paint these panels for a chapel in Houston from the Menil family, poor thing was paired with Philip Johnson, who did the architecture. Now, that chapel could be a great work of architecture, but there's that giant oculus on the top, which lets in all of the Texas light, which is extremely bright and present almost all year round. You see there's a tarp over that oculus. And that was the final compromise that Rothko was able to obtain in order to tone down that light so the chapel could appear the way he wanted. And the other thing is that Rothko was offended when one would say it's abstract, it doesn't have a subject. He said, my paintings are about the most basic subjects that humanity can have, emotions, tragedies, that feeling. That's what he was painting. And he wanted to approximate what someone like Fra Angelico could do. Another fabulous artist who's too little known, Bob Thompson, an African-American painter who had a tragically short career, died before he was 30, had about 8 years of mature work, 8,000 paintings that we know of, many of which were done here in Italy. And he loved Fra Angelico. You can see that he did a version of the deposition, and he, of course, simplified the works. It's a very modern style. What Thompson said he was after was to approximate the power that the old masters had, but he used very expressive color that was his own system. So notice that that figure of Christ and the loincloth are very, very white, right in the center of that composition. Then all of the figures around, you have black figures, yellow figures, orange figures, making a comment, but without really banging you on the head, about the diversity of color that exists in the world. And the orange and the yellow probably have something to do with homage to Angelico for his golds and light reflecting work. Thompson said, I paint these subjects because it makes me feel that my own life was more heroic. And here you can see him having a dialogue with that composition of the beheading of Cosmas and Damien, but by taking the figure that's kneeling and hanging it on a tree and blindfolding it, making it a black figure, he is commenting on the atrocities in that period of American history where there were lynchings in the South. And in fact, he calls his the execution. So here's how you can be moved by historical art and turn it into something that's very eloquent of your own time. And if you notice how the Renaissance figures have their brightly colored outfits and hoses, and then look at the colors of the figures that Thomson paints, again, he takes that from his predecessor and makes it say something for us to think about in terms of all of the races, all of the colors that exist in the world. Again, just a taste of Thomson. Luckily now, there's more interest in his work, and you can read great things written on Bob Thomson. David Hockney is very well known, and I hope most of you have gone down Via della Scala to the Profumeria di Santa Maria Novella to see David Hockney's homage to Fra Angelico, to the Annunciation. Hockney said that he was always looking at Fra Angelico. There was a giant poster in the corridor of his grade school. And as he was thinking, you know, he's got his ideas about how the old masters use perspective. He calls what he's doing reverse perspective. So it's part of a series of thinking of these new ideas through Renaissance paintings. That still will be up, I think, until the end of the month. And then let's just jump to, very timely, the New York Times. This exhibition has gotten so much interest that the New York Times had an editorial on it, and Raven Jiang made this wonderful illustration. And what was chosen? A wing coming out of that frame to stand for Fra Angelico. And I put it with one of Angelico's angels. And here I hope you can see a little bit these incisions, punches, color washes, you know, lake colors, cinnabars, moving in gradation down the wing. More of the angels, just to feast your eyes and to see each one very individualized, the treatment of each wing individualized. These, of course, from the arch around the Linaioli altarpiece. It's not only artists, painters who look to Fra Angelico. There's a dinner jacket by Elsa Schiaparelli. And when I saw that, I said, she was looking at Fra Angelico wings. To me, you know, now if I publish that, my colleagues might say, show me some proof of it. And at first I would not have had any. But when I went to an exhibition at the Met a couple of years ago, I saw that wing that I said, now come on, no one can tell me that was not based on a Fra Angelico wing. And when I looked at the catalog, I saw that the model, the sample from the House of Lesage of embroidery, called that particular piece Angelico. So here's my proof. Many people are thinking about that. Think of Antonio Tabucchi, who wrote that novella on the flying creatures of Fra Angelico. He had the creatures come and speak to him by moving their wings around. So this fact of Angelico gives many artists lots of ideas. And to stay in the fashion realm for a moment, Pier Paolo Piccioli, that's a B for Balenciaga. I was kind of hoping it was a B in my honor, but I have to be a good scholar and tell you that. He did that when he was given just now the appointment as the chief designer for Balenciaga. But you see that tattoo on his arm? He said, I'm never going to find it in my notes now because I haven't been following them, but basically he said that tattoo is really important to me because in the scales of the snake are taken from a wing of a Fra Angelico angel. So I said, Mr. Piccioli, you have got the right iconography from Eden, the serpent and the angel together. And his interest is shown also that when he was designing for Valentino, he did a little version of a Dominican habit that was also in that Met exhibition. And the curators of that exhibition thought that this dress by Jean Lavin from 1936 looked angelic. And they put the wings behind the mannequin. And then in the catalog, they put that little detail from the Last Judgment triptych. I pointed out that figure that they want to connect to the dress that they showed. So I'm not the only one who was thinking that way, for better or for worse. And let me finish up now, because I held you long enough with this, but I wanted to end with Miriam Shapiro, whom you might know. Everyone referred to as Mimi, and she was one of the most talented and convincing first wave feminists in a movement that they called pattern and decoration, sometimes called P&D. So I have taken one of her fans and put it near details, a detail from Fra Angelico, but I wanted you to look at the complexity with which she composes that fan. And one of the goals of the painters in this movement was to go against, we were saying, against that 20th century idea of minimalism, and to say decoration isn't frivolous, that these patterns, these shapes, these colors together do something, and it's important. And of course, a lot of men joined that movement too, who felt that this was a very necessary reclamation of the idea of patterning, which it wasn't something dismissive that only girls would do. And so I want to put Fra Angelico as a model, a forerunner of the pattern and decoration movement of the first wave feminists. Because when I look at this detail from one of Mimi Shapiro's fans, the one you were just looking at, have a look carefully at all of the little dots that make these curved forms. And I put this detail on its side just to make my point. There's a better image of it, tiny little dots to give you the more than impression, right? To make you see the beauty of that veil. And I think there's something in the approach that is quite similar, and in the love of these details, and also how to do it, because another wonderful artist in this movement, Joyce Kozlov, who's still working today, she's written some wonderful things about Shapiro's work, and she said that she would get tubes of acrylic paint that had glitter in it, so we're back to the glitter of the Annunciation wings, and get the nozzle, teeny tiny little nozzle, and just one after another to make these shimmering effects. So I thought the glitter in the angel's wing, the acrylics and sequins and glitter were all put on these canvases to make that point again about the beauty of it. So I'm going to end with this comparison of the glittering wing from the Annunciation. Look at how abstractly it was painted to give you the vision of a celestial wing, and look at the palettes that were used. That's not a usual palette, that kind of ochre yellow, a gray blue, a cerise, and I see it again in the Shapiro, and I've never been able to document that she studied Fra Angelico, but given how wonderful his patterns and decoration are, I would say there was a good chance on it. So I leave you with that idea, and thanks so much for your attention and for sticking with me.